The air in the town hall was thick with the scent of damp wool, stale beer, and self-satisfaction, each particle a tiny, smug witness to a grand cruelty. Ilara stood bone-still, a statue carved from silent fury. The steel in her veins was the only thing holding her upright, the only thing that kept her from shattering into 1,000 pieces on the grimy floorboards. Her hand was a vice around the smaller, colder hand of her brother, Leo, a boy of 7 whose world had been stolen and replaced with a grey, silent terror. His eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the motes of dust dancing in the single shaft of jaundiced light slanting from a high window, as if their meaningless ballet was the only thing he could bear to watch. Before them stood Master Thornton, the town magistrate, his face a fleshy canvas of contempt, his words slick with false piety as he recited the terms of the binding. It was not a marriage, it was a sentence. She was being given, like a stray animal, to the man who stood beside her. A mountain of a man, so large he seemed to block out the meager light, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight. The townspeople, packed into the hall like gossiping crows, whispered and snickered behind their hands. They called him the beast of the quarry, the silent oaf. Ilara had never seen him up close before, only glimpsed his hulking form from a distance, a local legend of ugliness and solitude. Now, she was bound to him. She refused to look at him, keeping her gaze locked on Thornton's polished boots, focusing on the hate that burned clean and hot inside her. It was a purer feeling than the cold dread that threatened to consume her. When Thornton finished, a smug finality in his voice, there was a smattering of mocking applause. He gestured dismissively towards the door. "Go on, then. To your sty at the edge of the woods. He is your keeper now." The walk to the cottage was a pilgrimage through shame. The path dwindled from cobblestone to muddy track, the jeering faces of the town replaced by the skeletal, grasping branches of the winter stark trees. The hovel was more ruin than cottage, a tumble of grey stones clinging to the hillside like a broken tooth. A gaping hole in the thatched roof stared up at the washed-out canvas of the sky. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of earth and old sorrows. There was a single, rickety cot with a threadbare blanket, a crude wooden table, and a fireplace black with ancient soot. It was a place of profound and utter desolation. Leo, who had not made a sound, began to tremble, his small body racked with silent shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. He burrowed his face into Ilara's skirt, a tiny anchor in a sea of fear. The man, her husband, the word a shard of glass in her mind, followed them in. He had to duck his massive head to clear the doorframe. He stood for a moment in the center of the small room, his sheer size seeming to shrink the space to nothing, and then, without a word, he turned. He walked to the cot, picked up the thin, worn blanket, and held it out to her. His eyes, which she finally forced herself to meet, were not cruel or vacant as she had expected. They were a deep, quiet brown, and they held an expression of weary, bottomless resignation. She flinched, but took the blanket. He then moved to the far corner, to a pile of old straw that served as a kennel for the wind, and lowered his immense body onto it. He turned his back to them, a silent, unmoving mountain of shadow, and the fragile truce of their first night began, woven from silence and a shared, unspoken misery. Ilara wrapped Leo and herself in the blanket, her heart a cold, hard knot of defiance. She would survive this. For Leo, she would endure anything. Days bled into one another, each dawn a smear of grey, each dusk a deeper shade of it. Their lives settled into a silent, monastic rhythm. The man, Silas, would rise before the sun, his movements surprisingly quiet for his size, and leave for the quarry. He would return long after sunset, coated in a fine white powder of stone dust that made him look like a weary ghost. Each evening, he would place a few coins, his wages, she presumed, on the corner of the wooden table. He never spoke. He never looked at her for more than a fleeting second. He ate his meager portion of bread and cheese on his pile of straw and seemed to take up as little space as a man of his size possibly could. Ilara, in turn, waged her own quiet war against the desolation. She found a broom of bound twigs and swept the dirt floor until it was hard-packed and clean. She used a shard of glass to scrape the grime from the single window pane, letting in a sliver more of the weak light. With thread she'd saved, she painstakingly mended the rents in the thin curtains and the holes in the blanket. Her hands, nimble and determined, were always moving, fighting back the decay. She found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the cottage and, with a sharpened stick, turned the soil, planting the few precious herb seeds she had carried in a pouch. It was an act of faith in a future she could not imagine. Leo remained her silent shadow. He would not leave her side, and when Silas was in the cottage, the boy would press himself into a corner, small and still, his eyes huge with a fear that had taken root in his soul. Ilara saw how Silas would carefully, deliberately, keep his back to the boy, as if trying to make his own enormous presence less threatening. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but she saw it. In the profound silence of their shared prison, every small movement, every averted glance, became a word, a sentence, a story. One afternoon, the rhythmic peace of her chores was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats and a familiar, grating laugh. Master Thornton sat astride his fat, glossy mare, reining it in just outside their pathetic excuse for a fence. He surveyed her small, newly turned garden with a theatrical sneer. "Well, well. Playing house in the pigsty, are we? One would almost think you were grateful." Ilara froze, her hands full of weeds. She felt Leo press against her legs, his small body rigid with fear. She said nothing, her chin held high, her eyes like chips of flint. Silas was sitting on a large rock near the cottage door, cleaning the quarry dust from his tools. At the sound of Thornton's voice, he had gone utterly still. He didn't look up, but the line of his broad back had become rigid, a bulwark of granite. Thornton's gaze slid from Ilara to Silas, dripping with contempt. "A fine prize you are," he drawled, looking Ilara up and down. "A bit of spirit." Entirely wasted on that lumbering ox, he smirked, enjoying his own cruelty. "Still, I suppose he keeps you warm at night, eh?" All that blubber at this, Silas slowly, deliberately, set his tools down on the rock beside him. He rose to his full, towering height. He did not speak. He did not clench his fists. He simply stood there, planting his feet firmly on the earth, and looked at Thornton. It was not a challenging stare, but one of immense, unassailable presence. He became a silent wall, a human shield standing between the sneering magistrate and the woman and child behind him. There was something in his stillness more intimidating than any threat. Thornton's horse shifted nervously. The magistrate's smirk faltered, his bravado shrinking under that quiet, immovable gaze. With a final, sputtering curse about insolence and taxes, he yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, his retreat more a rout than a departure. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her eyes met Silas's, just for a second, and in their brown depths, she saw it, a flicker of something ancient and defiant, the deep, proud fire that burns at the heart of a mountain. The breath of autumn turned sharp and cold, whispering through the cracks in the stone walls with a menacing chill. Leo developed a dry, rasping cough that echoed in the small cottage, each sound a fresh stab of fear in Ilara's heart. She made him teas from the mint she had managed to grow, but it wasn't enough. The nights grew longer and colder, and she would lie awake, listening to his labored breathing, her own helplessness a suffocating weight. They had no money for an apothecary, not after buying their meager rations of flour and salt. One evening, Silas returned from the quarry later than usual. He was still covered in the familiar mantle of white dust, but he carried something else besides his tools. He walked to the table and, without a word, set down a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Ilara watched him, wary. He retreated to his corner of straw, his back to her as always. Hesitantly, she approached the table and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a cluster of dried elderberries, a handful of potent-smelling coltsfoot leaves, and a small clay jar filled with dark, fragrant honey. Her breath caught in her throat. These were not things one could simply find by the roadside. He must have traded for them, perhaps giving up his own portion of bread, or a portion of his already pitiful wages. It was an offering. A silent, profound act of care. She made a syrup from the herbs and honey and coaxed a spoonful into Leo, whose coughing eased almost immediately. Later that week, a new routine began. After his evening meal, Silas would take a small block of wood and a sharp whittling knife and sit by the faint light of the fire. Leo, from his safe distance, began to watch. His fear of the large man was still present, but it was now tempered by a growing, cautious curiosity. He would watch Silas's massive, calloused hands that could break stone, move with an impossible delicacy, peeling away slivers of wood to slowly reveal a hidden shape. The gentle, rhythmic scrape of the knife was the only sound in the cottage, a quiet song of creation in the heart of the desolate night. The carving took shape over several nights. Silas worked with a deep, meditative patience, his entire focus narrowed to the small object in his hands. He seemed to fall away, leaving only the whisper of the blade on wood. Ilara would pretend to be busy with her mending, but she watched him from the corner of her eye, fascinated by the transformation. She saw not a brutish laborer, but an artist, his rough exterior hiding a core of surprising tenderness. One evening, the work was done. The next morning, before he left for the quarry, when he thought neither of them was looking, Silas placed the finished object on the outer ledge of the window, right where Leo often sat to watch the world. It was a bird, its head cocked, its tiny form so smooth it seemed to have been polished by water rather than carved by a knife. It was an object of simple, perfect beauty. For the entire day, Leo stared at the bird but did not touch it. He sat just inside the window, his gaze fixed on the gift left by the silent giant. The next morning, it was still there. Finally, his small hand, trembling slightly, reached out. His fingers brushed against the polished wood, then curled around it, claiming it. He brought the bird inside and held it cupped in both hands, his thumb stroking its smooth back. It was the first time in months he had shown interest in anything beyond the fold of his sister's skirt. He did not let it go. That night, the silence in the cottage felt different. It was no longer an empty, fearful void between them, but a shared space, filled with the unspoken weight of what had passed. A gift given, a gift received. As Silas sat on his straw, Ilara quietly picked up his heavy work tunic, ripped at the shoulder from a day of heaving stone. With her needle and thread, she began to stitch the tear, her small, careful movements a silent answer to his own. Winter arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a howling, violent gale. The wind tore at the cottage like a ravenous wolf, and an entire section of the old, rotten thatch was ripped from the roof, leaving them exposed to the biting rain. They spent a miserable night huddled by the fire, a bucket catching the worst of the icy drips. The next morning, his face contorted in a mask of malicious glee, Thornton arrived. The storm, it seemed, had presented him with an opportunity. A leaky roof, he announced, dismounting. A sign of dereliction. I'm instituting a new service tax for property upkeep. Payable immediately. He named a sum that was impossibly, cruelly high. He knew they couldn't pay. This was the pretense he needed. If you cannot pay, he said, his voice dripping with false regret, I'll have no choice but to evict you. Cast you out. The law is the law. His eye scanned the miserable interior and landed on Leo, who was clutching his wooden bird for comfort. What's that trinket? A worthless bit of wood. He reached out, his soft, grasping hand intending to snatch it away. In a movement so swift it was almost a blur, Silas was there. He didn't strike Thornton. He didn't even touch him. His huge hand simply closed over Leo's, forming a protective shell around the boy's small fist and the precious bird within it. It was the gesture of a guardian, absolute and immovable. With his other hand, he slowly, deliberately, pointed towards the gate. A low sound rumbled up from his chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very flagstones of the floor. It was the first word Ilara had ever heard him speak. Go. It was not a plea. It was a command, forged from pure will, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of silence. Thornton, for all his bluster, was stunned. He stared, open-mouthed, at the man he had dismissed as a witless beast. The raw, primal authority in that single word was more powerful than any weapon. Sputtering, his face turning a blotchy red, Thornton backed away, mounted his horse, and fled. The echo of that one word, go, hung in the air long after Thornton had disappeared. It had shifted something fundamental in their small world, breaking the spell of fear and submission. Ilara looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw him not as a burden she was forced to endure, but as a fortress. His silence wasn't a void, it was a deep reservoir of strength, guarded with a stoic dignity she was only now beginning to comprehend. The wall of resentment in her own heart, built brick by painful brick, finally crumbled. That night, as Silas slept on his bed of straw, his massive shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm, Ilara did something she wouldn't have imagined a week before. She took the old, faded quilt, the last remnant of her former life, a patchwork of memories she had guarded jealously, and gently unfolded it. She walked across the small room and draped it over his sleeping form. It was a gesture of peace, of acceptance, of a shared warmth against the world's cold. The next day, they began to repair the roof. There were no words, no discussion of a plan. None was needed. He moved with an innate understanding of weight and balance, lifting the heavy stones and beams as if they were kindling. She, in turn, gathered fresh thatch, her nimble fingers weaving and binding it into place. They moved in a seamless, unspoken rhythm, a silent dance of creation. He was the strength, she was the skill. Together, they were whole. Leo, his fear now completely gone, no longer hid. He would sit on the doorstep, his wooden bird held tight, and watch them work. Sometimes, he would even sit near Silas as the big man began a new project in the evenings, methodically, patiently, laying a foundation of stone for a proper wall to protect Ilara's small, hopeful garden. The final confrontation came on a day when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Thornton, his pride wounded and his cruelty festering, returned. This time, he was not alone. He brought 2 brutish men with him, hired thugs whose faces were dull with mindless obedience. His intention was clear: force. He would drag them from the cottage and make a public spectacle of their humiliation to restore his authority. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire, and soon, a crowd of townspeople had gathered at a distance, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and fearful deference. "This is the end of your defiance," Thornton bellowed, his voice unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "You will be driven from this land, you worthless beast. And you," he spat at Ilara, "will learn the price of insolence." He gestured for his men to move forward. They advanced, their heavy boots crunching on the gravel. Silas did not move from his position before the cottage door. He stood, his feet planted, his hands empty at his sides. He was not a warrior preparing for a fight, he was a mountain refusing to be moved. In that moment, Ilara stepped forward and stood beside him, her small frame a stark contrast to his immense one. She placed her hand on his powerful forearm, a silent declaration. "We are together." The thugs hesitated for a half-step, faced with this united front. But before they could take another, a small figure darted past them. It was Leo. With a courage that stunned the entire crowd into silence, the little boy walked directly to the towering man he had once feared more than anything. He stopped before Silas, tilted his head back, and held up the small wooden bird. With a gesture of profound and perfect trust, he gently placed the carving into Silas's massive, stone-dusted palm. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The simple, silent act of a child offering his most prized possession to his protector was a verdict more powerful than any magistrate's decree. In that single, breathtaking moment, the townspeople saw everything with new eyes. They saw not a hulking beast, but a gentle guardian. They saw not a disgraced woman, but a fierce defender of her family. They saw not an ugly, forced arrangement, but a bond forged in the crucible of hardship and quiet kindness. The narrative Thornton had so carefully crafted was shattered. The cruelty and arrogance he wore like a fine coat were suddenly rendered transparent, exposing the petty, cowardly man beneath. The shame that had been forced upon Ilara and Silas now recoiled upon its source, settling squarely on Thornton's shoulders. His thugs stopped dead, their brutish certainty dissolving. They looked from the child to the giant to their employer, unwilling to be the villains in this devastatingly quiet morality play. Thornton's face cycled through shock, rage, and finally, utter humiliation. Exposed, defeated not by force but by love, he turned without another word and stormed away, his hired men trailing behind him like chastened dogs. The crowd quietly dispersed, their whispered conversations no longer filled with mockery, but with a newfound, grudging respect. Later that evening, the cottage was filled with the warm, flickering light of the fire. The repaired roof held strong against the wind. Ilara watched as Silas sat at the table, the tiny wooden bird resting in the center of his palm, looking impossibly fragile and infinitely precious. He lifted his head and his eyes met hers across the small room. They were clear, and they held a universe of emotion she could now fully read. A low, steady rumble came from his chest, not a command this time, but a revelation, rusty from disuse. "My name," he said, "is Silas." A true, radiant smile bloomed on Ilara's face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "I know," she whispered back. For the first time, she truly did.